Hey there, viewers. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me ask, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. Today's revelation comes with a chilling twist. Diddy's ex-security guard exposed something terrifying, and just hours later he was gone. This might be the most disturbing piece of the puzzle yet. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Missing Man. I first saw him on a Tuesday night, though I didn't know it at the time. It was one of those cold, wet evenings where the city smelled like damp concrete and burnt coffee. The kind of night where everything felt slowed down, like the world was waiting for something to happen. I had just stepped out of a small hole-in-the-wall bar, shaking off the warmth inside, when I noticed him leaning against the lamppost across the street. He was just another shadow among many, dressed in dark clothes, his hood pulled low. At first, I thought he was a junkie, or maybe just someone trying to stay out of the rain, but then I noticed something odd. He wasn't looking at his phone. No cigarette, no movement, nothing. He was just standing there, watching. I wasn't in the mood for games. I turned the corner and kept walking, but not without checking over my shoulder. He followed, not close, but not far enough to be coincidence either. He kept his distance, just outside of suspicion, but inside of certainty. 2 blocks down, I ducked into a bodega, pretending to browse a rack of outdated magazines. The fluorescent hum of the lights buzzed overhead, mixing with the quiet murmur of a Spanish soap opera playing on a TV behind the counter. I grabbed a bottle of water, paid the old man at the register, and stepped back outside. He was gone, but not for long. I made it back to my apartment without issue, locking the door behind me, checking the deadbolt twice, a habit I never quite grew out of. Just as I exhaled, the knock came. 3 short taps, precise, purposeful. I stood there, debating whether to open it. Then came another 3 knocks, this time softer. I approached, checking the peephole. There he was, same hood, same stance, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He wasn't looking up at me, he was looking down the hallway, as if checking to see if someone else was watching. I should have ignored it, should have turned around and let it be someone else's problem. But that's the thing about people like me. We don't let things go. I unlocked the door, just a crack. "Can I help you?" He didn't step forward, didn't try to push his way in. His voice was low, like he was afraid someone might be listening. "You're the guy who looks into things." I said nothing. He shifted on his feet, glancing down the hallway again. "I need to talk." "About what?" A pause, then him. That got my attention. I opened the door wider, enough to let him in, but not enough to seem like an invitation. He hesitated, then stepped inside. He didn't take off his hood, didn't even shake off the rain. He just stood there, dripping onto the floor. Up close, he looked worse than I expected. Hollow cheeks, dark circles, the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from missing a night's sleep, but from missing years of it. His hands twitched at his sides, a nervous energy barely contained. "You got a name?" I asked. He shook his head. "Fair enough." I gestured to the couch, but he stayed standing. He scanned my apartment. Books stacked on the table, a half-empty coffee cup by the window, a single light casting long shadows. "They don't know I'm here," he said finally. I leaned against the counter. "Who's they?" His jaw clenched. He turned toward the window, watching the street below. "You already know." That was the moment I realized he wasn't here for my help. He was here because he had already made a mistake, and he was trying to figure out if he could undo it. I stayed quiet, letting the tension sit between us. I'd played this game before. Wait long enough and people will talk just to fill the silence. And he did. "I worked for him," he muttered, barely above a whisper. I knew exactly who he meant. For the next few minutes, he spoke in half-finished thoughts, circling around something without landing on it. He had been close, closer than most. He had seen things that he couldn't shake, things that had eaten at him until there was nothing left but paranoia and regret. I stayed quiet, he admitted, his voice almost breaking. I saw what happened to the ones who didn't. That was the first time I felt the weight of what he was saying. I had heard rumors, sure, everyone had, but to hear it from someone who had been there, to see the fear etched into his face, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into my hand. A piece of paper, folded and damp from the rain. "Don't open it now," he said. "Wait." Then, just like that, he turned and walked to the door. I followed, but he stopped me with a look that said he had already gone too far. "I shouldn't have come here," he muttered. "They don't leave loose ends." And then he was gone. I stood there for a long moment before locking the door again, checking the deadbolt twice, then 3 times. I unfolded the paper. There was no message, no explanation. Just an address. A place I had never been. A place I was never supposed to go. Chapter 2. A dead end that isn't. The next morning I woke up with the same uneasy feeling I'd gone to sleep with. That address burned in my mind like a warning, like something I shouldn't have seen. I told myself I'd give it some time, let the dust settle before poking around too much. But I knew that was a lie. There was no waiting when it came to something like this. Either you walked away or you dove straight in. And I wasn't the type to walk away. I pulled out the scrap of paper he had given me, running my thumb over the ink as I sat at my desk, coffee growing cold beside me. It was just an address, nothing more, no context, no explanation. But that was enough. I reached for my phone and dialed the number he had scribbled beneath it. The first ring stretched too long, then the second, then the third. My fingers drummed against the desk as I listened to the dead air between rings. No voicemail, no automated message, just nothing. By the 8th ring, I hung up. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. A call back, a text, a sign that he was still out there. But nothing came. I tried again. Same result. That sinking feeling in my gut grew heavier, like something had already gone wrong before I even had a chance to understand it. I needed more. The only place I could start was the diner. The city felt different that morning, quieter, or maybe I was just more aware. The usual honking and chatter blended into a dull hum in the background, but my focus was elsewhere. I kept glancing at my mirrors as I drove, checking faces, looking for something, though I wasn't sure what. A tail? A familiar car? Paranoia had already started creeping in, and I hadn't even uncovered anything yet. I pulled up to the diner just past 10. The same neon sign buzzed faintly, the same half-empty parking lot, but something about it felt off, like I was looking at a picture that had been altered slightly, just enough to make you doubt your memory. I stepped inside, scanning the booths. The same waitress was behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper. Same old man at the far end sipping his coffee. I walked up to the counter, resting my hands against the cool surface. The waitress looked up, chewing gum slowly. "Morning," she said, giving me a quick once-over. "Morning," I nodded. "I was here last night. Met a guy, sat in the back booth. Hoodie, dark clothes. You remember him?" She frowned slightly, tapping her fingers against the counter. "You sure it was here?" I glanced back at the booth. The same booth. "Yeah, right there." She followed my gaze, then shook her head. "I don't remember anyone like that." I studied her face, trying to read whether she was lying or if this was something worse. "I sat with him for a while. He left before midnight." She shrugged, looking genuinely confused. "We don't get a lot of people at that time, hon. I'd remember if someone like that came in." I stared at her for a moment longer, then glanced at the old man at the far booth. He'd been there last night too. I walked over, stepping carefully. He didn't look up, just kept stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice casual. "You were here last night. You remember the guy I was talking to?" He finally glanced up, blinking at me like I had just started speaking another language. "There was no one with you," he said simply, his voice raspy, like someone who had spent too many years smoking. A chill ran through me. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. "You sure?" The old man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, then went back to stirring his coffee. I felt the weight of something unspoken pressing against me. I turned and left, stepping back into the daylight, the air suddenly feeling too thick. My mind raced. It wasn't just that they didn't remember him. It was like he had never been there. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging. I called in favors, reached out to old contacts, looking for any trace of a security guard matching his description. It was like trying to chase a ghost. No social media, no public records, no old photos, nothing. I even checked some old employee lists from Bad Boy Records. Nothing there either. He had worked for Diddy, I was sure of that much, but there was no sign of him anywhere. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, I had only one lead left. A guy named Marcus, an ex-security detail for Diddy back in the early 2000s. He had gotten out, moved on, but if anyone had known the man I spoke to last night, it would be him. I found his number, took a breath, and dialed. It rang twice before he picked up. "Who is this?" His voice was rough, skeptical. "I'm looking for someone," I said. "Used to work security for Bad Boy. I think you might have worked together." A pause, then, "What's his name?" That was the problem, I didn't know. He worked for Diddy. Not sure how long, but he left recently. Silence on the other end. Then Marcus exhaled slowly, like someone piecing together a puzzle in real time. "I think you should stop looking," he said. I clenched my jaw. "So you do know him?" Another long pause, then, "I didn't say that." But he had. "Look, I just want to know what happened to him." Marcus shifted. I could hear the tension in his breath, the slight edge in his voice when he finally spoke. "In things," he muttered. "Real things, and he wasn't the type to keep quiet forever." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "What kind of things?" I asked. But I never got an answer. The line went dead. I pulled the phone from my ear, staring at the screen. Call ended. No warning, no goodbye. That's when the call came in. Blocked number. I hesitated for just a second before answering. I didn't speak first. I waited. The other end was silent at first, just faint static, like someone was there but wasn't saying anything. Then, a low breath. Not quite a whisper, not quite a sigh. "You need to stop looking." Click. The call ended. I sat there, the silence stretching around me. And for the first time, I wondered if I had already gone too far. Chapter 3. What he saw. The voice from the blocked numbers still echoed in my mind. The way they had spoken. Not a threat, not a warning, but a statement. "You need to stop looking." It wasn't an argument, not a plea. It was something else entirely. Something absolute. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the street outside my apartment. Every car looked suspicious, every shadow stretched too far. I told myself I wasn't paranoid, just cautious. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I could feel the weight of something pressing down on me. I wasn't supposed to be digging. I stared down at the list of names in my notebook. It was short, only 3 contacts left, 3 people who had been around when James was working security. The first 2 led to dead ends. One had moved out of state years ago and the other refused to speak at all. But the third, that was where things got interesting. Her name was Isabel Reyes, a former housekeeper at one of Diddy's properties. She had worked there for over a decade, before suddenly quitting without notice. No public explanation, no scandal, just gone. I managed to track down a number and called. The line rang so long I almost hung up. Then, just as I was about to end the call, she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was cautious, hesitant. I kept my tone calm. "Is this Isabel?" Silence. "Who is this?" she asked, voice tight with suspicion. I took a breath. "I'm trying to find out what happened to someone who used to work security at the mansion." I didn't say Diddy's name. I didn't have to. "I think you knew him." Another pause, then she exhaled. "I don't know anything," she said quickly. "I can't help you." She was about to hang up. I could hear it in her voice. "You told him to run, didn't you?" I said. Silence. I could hear the tension in the air between us, thick and heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. "Meet me at St. Mary's Church," she muttered. "By the back lot, 15 minutes. Then she was gone. The church parking lot was nearly empty when I pulled in. A single street lamp flickered above, casting long, shifting shadows against the pavement. A few yards away, by the entrance to the side alley, a woman stood with her arms crossed, hood pulled up over her head. She looked different from what I had expected. Early 50s, tired eyes, the kind of expression that belonged to someone who had spent years carrying the weight of something they weren't meant to know. "Ethan?" she asked. I nodded. "Isabel?" She glanced around, making sure we were alone, then motioned for me to follow her around the back of the church. The air smelled like wet stone and candle wax. When we were finally out of sight from the street, she leaned in, lowering her voice. "I shouldn't be talking to you." I didn't respond. I just waited. She hesitated, rubbing her hands together. Then, finally, she spoke. "I knew him," she said. "He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but one night, something changed." She looked past me, as if watching something that wasn't there. "He wasn't supposed to be in that part of the house. None of us were." "What part?" I asked. "The lounge," she whispered. The way she said it sent a chill through me. "What happened there?" She swallowed, shaking her head. "I don't know. I never went inside. But I remember seeing him that night, pacing the hallway outside the door. His hands were shaking, his face was pale. He kept muttering to himself over and over. I tried to ask what was wrong, but he wouldn't answer. I could see it, clear as day. The dimly lit hallway, the flickering light above the door, the hush of voices behind it. James standing there, looking like a man who had just seen something he could never unsee. "What was he saying?" I pressed. Isabel hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I wish I didn't know. I wish I never walked into that room." A heavy silence settled between us. I felt my stomach tighten. "And you never asked him what he saw?" She shook her head. "I didn't have to. I saw it in his eyes. It was bad, worse than bad." I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling. I had heard whispers about hidden rooms before, places where people weren't supposed to go. I had always dismissed them as exaggerations, industry paranoia. Now, I wasn't so sure. "There has to be more," I pushed. "Something he said later, something he—" "I told you," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." She took a step back, eyes darting around the lot. "I shouldn't have come here." I could feel her slipping away. "Isabel?" "No." She cut me off, shaking her head. "You need to leave this alone." She turned, heading toward her car. I wanted to push further, to press her for details, but then I saw something that stopped me cold. The car. A black SUV parked at the far end of the lot, half hidden in the shadows. The engine was running, tinted windows. We weren't alone. I felt my pulse spike. Isabel saw it too. She yanked open her car door, sliding inside without another word. Within seconds, she was gone, tires screeching against the pavement as she pulled onto the road. I stood there, my heart hammering. The SUV didn't move. I didn't either. I had a choice: get in my car and leave, or see how far they were willing to go. I chose the latter. I stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The SUV remained still, engine humming. Then, as I drew closer, the headlights flashed once, a warning. I stopped, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the SUV pulled away, disappearing down the street. I stood there for a long moment, the night air thick with something unspoken. James had seen something in that room, something that had broken him. And now someone knew that I was looking for it. I had a feeling they wouldn't warn me twice. Chapter 4: The Lounge That Doesn't Exist. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James standing outside that door, his hands shaking, his voice nothing but a whisper. I wish I didn't know. I wish I never walked into that room. What the hell did he see in there? And why was everyone so afraid to talk about it? The black SUV in the church parking lot wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was watching. Someone knew I was asking questions, but they hadn't stopped me yet. Maybe they thought I'd get scared and drop it. Maybe they assumed I was just another idiot chasing a ghost story. They were wrong. By morning, I had a plan. If I wanted to find out what James saw that night, I had to start from the beginning. That meant figuring out exactly where it happened. I spent the next few hours digging. It wasn't hard to find old articles about the property, magazine spreads, real estate records, even old interviews with interior designers who had worked on the place. Diddy's mansion had been renovated multiple times over the years, but the original blueprints were still on file with the city. It took some maneuvering, but I managed to pull them. The house was massive, as expected. Sprawling wings, multiple levels, more rooms than anyone could ever need, but something caught my eye almost immediately. The basement. The blueprints showed a large, open concept space, divided into storage, a wine cellar, and a lounge area. But when I cross-checked it with newer schematics from a home renovation feature in Architectural Digest, something was off. The updated layout of the house showed the basement as significantly smaller. A huge section of it was missing. Not repurposed, not redesigned. Just gone, like it had never existed. I stared at the blueprints, tracing my fingers over the missing space. If Isabel was right, if James had seen something terrible, it had happened there. I needed to talk to someone who had actually been inside, someone who had worked there. That's how I found Victor Langley. Victor was an audio engineer, someone who had spent years working behind the scenes at private recording sessions. He wasn't famous, but he had been in rooms where some of the biggest records of the past decade had been made. I found his name buried in old liner notes, credited as an assistant on one of Diddy's projects. A little more digging, and I found out he had worked in the mansion's home studio before he abruptly left the music industry. I tracked him down to a small town in upstate New York, where he was running a barely functional recording space out of a converted garage. When I called, he picked up on the third ring. "Who's this?" I kept my voice steady. "I'm looking into something. A security guy who worked for Diddy." "You might have met him." Silence. Then, "Don't know what you're talking about." He hung up. I called back. He ignored it. I waited 5 minutes, then sent a text. "It's about the basement. I know about the missing rooms." A minute passed. Then another. Then my phone buzzed. "Come alone. Midnight. Edgewater Marina." The docks were empty when I arrived. Cold air rolled in off the water, thick with the scent of damp wood and rust. The place was quiet except for the occasional creak of a boat shifting against its mooring. Victor was already there, leaning against an old pickup truck, smoking a cigarette. He looked like a man who had aged too fast. Deep lines around his eyes, stubble that had gone more gray than black. "You shouldn't have come," he muttered as I approached. "You told me to," I pointed out. He exhaled, flicking the cigarette onto the ground and crushing it under his boot. I thought you'd be smarter than that. I wasn't in the mood for games. The basement, I said. The missing rooms. What was down there? Victor didn't answer right away. He just stared past me, out over the water. Finally, he said, "They called it the Blue Room." I felt my pulse quicken. What was it? Victor rubbed a hand over his face. It wasn't supposed to be there. The first time I saw it, I knew something was wrong. It didn't match the rest of the house. Everything else was pristine, designed to impress. But that place, it felt different. Dark, cold, like it didn't belong. A shiver ran through me. What happened inside? Victor shook his head. I don't know everything. I only went down there once, and that was enough. I took a step closer. James saw something in there. Victor let out a bitter laugh. I bet he did. I clenched my fists. Tell me what you saw. Victor hesitated, then his voice dropped lower. It wasn't just a lounge. It was a place. A place where people went when they needed to be reminded of who was in charge. You ever hear stories about people disappearing from the industry? One day they're on top of the world, the next they vanish. That room had something to do with it. A cold chill ran through me. Victor took another cigarette out of his pocket but didn't light it, just turned it over in his fingers, lost in thought. I remember walking in there for the first time. It wasn't just a room, it was set up for something. The lighting, the soundproofing. It was built for privacy. He looked up at me. Built so that nobody outside would ever hear a thing. My stomach twisted. Who went down there? Victor let out a slow breath. The ones who mattered. I didn't like the way he said that. What happened the night you were there? I asked. Victor's jaw tightened. I was supposed to set up mics for a private recording session, some kind of spoken word thing. I got the call at the last minute. No explanation, just an address and a time. When I got there, they took me down through a separate entrance. There was a hallway, blue lighting running along the walls, like a runway leading into darkness. I could picture it, the air thick with something unspoken, the heavy silence of a place designed to keep secrets. Victor's voice grew distant, like he was remembering something he had spent years trying to forget. I was only in there for a few minutes. I didn't see much, but I heard enough. I swallowed hard. What did you hear? Victor shook his head. A voice, someone pleading, begging. He exhaled shakily, and then nothing, just silence. A long pause stretched between us. I felt my fingers twitch at my sides. Who was down there? Victor looked at me for a long time. Then he whispered, "You already know." A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Victor tossed his cigarette into the water. That was the last night I ever worked there. I packed my shit and left the next day. I wanted to ask more, but I could see it in his face. He wasn't going to say anything else. He turned, walking back to his truck. "Wait," I called. He hesitated. I swallowed. What happened to James? Victor's expression darkened. Then, softly, he said, "He got too close." The engine of his truck rumbled to life. I watched as his taillights faded into the night. I stood there for a long time, the words echoing in my head. James had seen something in that room, something that wasn't supposed to be seen. And now, I was looking for it too. Chapter 5, the last 24 hours. I had enough now to know one thing for certain. James had been running. But running from what? Victor's words haunted me. He got too close. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. James had seen something inside that blue room, something he wasn't supposed to see. And when people like him, people working security, caught a glimpse of something they shouldn't. They only had two choices: stay quiet or disappear. I needed to know which one James had chosen, or if the choice had ever been his to make. I started with the diner, the last place I had seen him. The waitress still pretended not to remember him, and the old man in the booth just stared blankly when I asked again. I didn't push. Some people lied because they were scared, others because they were paid to. Either way, I wasn't getting anything from them. But there was something else, something I had missed before. Across the street, a gas station. It had a perfect view of the diner's entrance. If James had left in a hurry, if someone had followed him, there was a good chance it had been caught on camera. I walked in, the scent of stale coffee and motor oil clinging to the air. The cashier was a young guy, maybe early 20s, hoodie pulled up over his head, scrolling through his phone with half-lidded eyes. I leaned on the counter, waiting for him to acknowledge me. He didn't. I tapped the counter once. "Hey." He glanced up, clearly irritated that I had pulled him from whatever feed he was doom-scrolling through. "Yeah? I need to see your security footage from last night, around 11. He let out a short laugh. "Yeah, okay. Let me just violate all kinds of privacy laws for you real quick." I pulled out my wallet, sliding 3 crisp $100 bills across the counter. His smirk faded. After a moment, he sighed and grabbed the money. "Hold up." He disappeared into the back room. I heard the hum of an old monitor, the tap of keys. A minute later, he came back with a USB drive, tossing it onto the counter. "There, it'll overwrite in a few hours, so don't come back asking for more." I pocketed the drive. "Appreciate it." "Whatever, man." I plugged in the USB at home, staring at the grainy black and white footage. The timestamp read 11:06 p.m. James walked into the frame, crossing the lot toward the station. Even in the poor quality video, I could tell he was rattled. His hands trembled as he dug through his pockets. He pulled out his phone, but his fingers hovered over the screen like he wasn't sure if he should make a call. Then something changed. James stiffened, looking over his shoulder. I rewound the footage, paused, enhanced. There, on the far right side of the frame, a black SUV parked just outside the station, engine running, tinted windows. James saw it too. His head jerked back around, his breath visible in the cold air. He turned, walked inside the station. I fast-forwarded. James stood at the counter, speaking frantically to the cashier, the same kid I had talked to. But here's the thing. In the footage, the cashier wasn't on his phone. He was staring at James, and he wasn't ignoring him. He was listening, for a long time. Then James laughed. It didn't even buy anything. And the second he walked out, the black SUV pulled away. I didn't like what that implied. I went back to the gas station the next day, but the cashier wasn't there. Some middle-aged woman in thick-rimmed glasses stood behind the counter now, and when I asked about him, she just gave me a blank look. "Ooh, we don't got anyone like that working here." My stomach twisted. "Are you sure?" "Young guy, hoodie, tall..." "Nope." She cut me off. "You buying something or what?" I walked out. Whoever that kid was, he wasn't coming back. Just like James. The apartment was next. It wasn't easy tracking down James' address. He hadn't left much of a paper trail. No utilities in his name, no lease records, nothing. But I finally found a property under a shell company, rented by someone who matched his description. When I got there, the door was slightly open. Not just unlocked. Open. I stepped inside, slow, careful. The place was empty, completely stripped. No furniture, no clothes, no personal items. Nothing. Like he had never lived there. But something was wrong. It wasn't the usual signs of someone who packed up and left. It wasn't just empty. It had been wiped clean. The kitchen counters were spotless, the floor recently vacuumed. The walls looked freshly painted, as if they were covering something up. Even the air felt different. Too sterile, too clean. This wasn't abandoned. This was erased. And that meant someone had been here after James disappeared. I stepped further in, scanning for anything they might have missed. A loose floorboard, something shoved behind a vent, a piece of paper wedged in the cracks of the hardwood, anything. And then I saw it. It mirrored the bathroom. It was the only thing still hanging on the wall. No dust, no fingerprints, but when I stepped closer, I noticed something faint at the edges of the glass. Smudges. I exhaled, my breath fogging the glass slightly, and then there it was. A message. Faint, almost wiped away, but still there. They know, they know, they know. My skin crawled. James had written this, probably right before he disappeared. I reached for my phone, taking a photo, but the second I did, my screen glitched. Lines of static flickered across the display. The camera app froze. The phone shut off. I stared at it, heartbeat thudding. Then, without warning, the screen turned back on. But it wasn't on the home screen. It was dialing a number. A blocked number. I didn't touch anything. I didn't press a button. But the call was going through. I clenched my jaw, heart pounding. A click. Then breathing. Slow, methodical. Someone listening. I gripped the phone. Who is this? No response. Just more breathing. Then, finally, a whisper. Turn around. My blood ran cold. I froze. Didn't breathe, didn't move. The bathroom door was still open. I could see into the hallway. It was empty. But the feeling was there, the presence. Like someone was standing right behind me. Watching. The phone cut out. Silence. I turned, slowly. The hallway was still empty. But I knew I wasn't alone. I left the apartment without looking back. I had everything I needed. James hadn't run. He had been taken. And I had just made the mistake of proving that I was next. Chapter 6. The People Who Don't Exist. I didn't sleep after leaving James's apartment. My body was exhausted, my mind frayed at the edges, but there was no shutting it off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that message in the mirror. They know. I heard the whisper through the phone. Turn around. I knew one thing. Whoever had cleaned out that apartment had been there when I was inside. They had been watching. Maybe waiting. And I had walked right into it. I sat in my car, parked 3 blocks away, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The air felt heavy. Every single road I had gone down had led to the same place. Nowhere. But that wasn't an accident. It wasn't just that James had vanished. It wasn't just that his apartment had been wiped clean. It was that every trace of anyone connected to him was either gone or dead. And that wasn't coincidence. I started with the private investigator. His name was Michael Carter, an ex-cop who had turned to private work after getting pushed out of the force. He was the kind of guy who handled dirty jobs, cheating spouses, corporate espionage, and, occasionally, high-profile clients who needed things buried. James had hired him months before he disappeared. I found his office address in Brooklyn, a second-floor unit above a pawn shop. But when I got there, the place was shuttered. Dust covered the glass door, and a final notice of eviction was taped to the front. I walked into the pawn shop downstairs, the air thick with the scent of old metal and dust. The guy behind the counter was about 60, balding, wearing a stained flannel. He glanced up when I walked in. "Help you?" I nodded toward the door upstairs. "What happened to the guy who used to rent that office?" The old man snorted. "Carter? Haven't seen him in weeks." "Did he say anything before he left?" "It didn't leave," the man corrected. "One day he was here, next day his shit was packed up and gone." He leaned against the counter. "No notice." no movers, just gone. That sinking feeling returned. "Anyone come looking for him?" I asked. The old man hesitated. "A couple guys, real clean-cut types. Didn't look like the usual scumbags Carter dealt with." "The feds?" "No, it was something else." "What'd they ask?" "They didn't ask anything," he muttered. "They just looked around and left. Didn't even seem surprised he wasn't there. Like they already knew." I left, stepping back into the cold. Carter was gone, just like James. Next, I went after James' former co-workers. The first name on the list was Antonio Reyes. He had worked security for Bad Boy in the late 2000s, but left after a dispute with management. He had died in a car accident in 2017. I checked the police report. Single vehicle crash, no witnesses, no foul play suspected. Just another unlucky statistic. I moved on to the second name, Darren Cole. He had been on Diddy's payroll for years before suddenly leaving the country in 2019. No explanation, just packed up and moved to South America. I tracked down a last known number. Dialed it. It rang once, twice. Then, a robotic voice. "This number is no longer in service. Gone. Just like the others." I sat in my car, staring at my notes. Everyone James had known, everyone he had worked with, had either disappeared, died, or was erased. And now I was starting to understand why. I looked up at the rearview mirror. A car was parked across the street. A black sedan. Not an SUV this time, but it didn't need to be. It had been there when I walked into the pawn shop, and it was still there now. I didn't move. I didn't react. I just watched. The windows were tinted. The engine was off. I sat there for 5 minutes, then 10. The car never moved. Whoever they weren't just watching. They were waiting. I left the car, keeping my movements slow, casual. Walked down the block, glancing at reflections in the shop windows. The black sedan stayed parked, but the moment I rounded the corner, I heard it. An engine turning over. I didn't look back, I just kept walking. Up ahead, I saw a small diner, the kind of place with yellowed booths and a payphone in the back. I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The waitress behind the counter looked up, late 40s, tired eyes. I gave her a nod and walked straight to the back, grabbing a seat facing the entrance. I needed a moment to think. But I wasn't getting one, because as I reached for my phone, something slid across the table. A folded piece of paper. I stared at it, then looked up. A man had just walked past my booth, mid-50s, gray suit, no tie. He never looked at me, just kept moving toward the exit. I grabbed the paper and unfolded it. Only 4 words were written inside. "You're asking too much." The bell above the door jingled again. The man in the gray suit was already gone. I felt the weight of it settling on me, the walls closing in. This wasn't just about James anymore. It was about everyone like him. The ones who saw too much. The ones who asked the wrong questions. The ones who thought they could get out. James had been a loose end. And now, so was I. I clenched my fists, staring down at the paper, my pulse hammering. They were trying to scare me, trying to push me back before I got too close. But they had underestimated me. I wasn't backing off. Not now, because I wasn't just looking for James anymore. I was looking for the truth, and someone didn't want me to find it. Chapter 7. The Final Message. I didn't go home that night. I drove aimlessly for hours, keeping an eye on my mirrors, pulling into parking lots and side streets, waiting to see if that black sedan was still following me. But it never reappeared. That didn't make me feel better. If anything, it was worse. Whoever they were, they had made their point. They didn't need to tail me anymore. They had already left their message. "You're asking too much." I stopped at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, ordered coffee I wouldn't drink, and pulled out my laptop. I had nothing left to go on. No leads, no contacts, no one willing to talk. I was running out of road. Then I thought about James. I had been so focused on what he had seen, I hadn't thought to check if he had left anything behind. I opened my email, scrolled through old messages. Nothing. Then I checked my spam folder. That's when I saw it. No subject, no sender, just a timestamp. Sent 2 weeks ago. James. My stomach tightened. My hands felt suddenly unsteady as I hovered over it, debating whether to click. It felt like a trap, but I had come too far to stop now. I opened the email. There was nothing inside except for an attachment. A video file. I hesitated, then pressed play. The screen was dark at first, just audio, breathing, shaky, uneven, like someone trying to keep quiet while knowing they were being watched. Then James' face appeared. He was in a motel room. The lighting was dim, casting shadows under his eyes. He looked exhausted, unshaven, paranoid. He kept glancing toward the door like he expected someone to break it down at any second. "If you're watching this," he whispered, voice barely above a breath. I didn't make it. The words sent an icy shock through my veins. James swallowed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know how much time I have. They're closing in. They've been closing in." He exhaled shakily. "I thought I could outrun them. I thought..." He stopped, his head snapping toward the window, listening. Silence. His breathing quickened, his eyes darted back to the camera. "This isn't just about him," James whispered. "You think it is, but it's not. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than him. It's not just one man." The video glitched, lines of static distorting the frame for a second before returning to normal. James ran a hand through his hair, his leg bouncing. "You don't understand. He's not the top. He never was. That's the lie. That's what they let you believe. He's just..." The video cut again. When it came back, James looked directly at the camera, desperate. "If you go looking for the truth..." Another glitch. Then, a knock at his door. James froze. His breath hitched, his head turned, staring at the door like it was something alive. Another knock. Then, muffled voices. James' hands clenched into fists. "They already know you're looking." The screen cut to black. The video ended. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The silence in the diner felt deafening. The last words repeated in my head like a warning. "They already know you're looking." I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. The video was incomplete, but it didn't matter. James had tried to warn me. He had seen something, realized something, and for that, he had disappeared. But what had he meant? It's bigger than him. Bigger than Diddy? That was the part that didn't make sense. The world saw him as the puppet master, the one pulling the strings. If James was right, if Diddy was just another piece on the board, then who the hell was really in control? The thought made my stomach turn. I closed the laptop. I needed time to process, but I wasn't getting time. Because the moment I reached for my coffee, my computer screen flickered. Lines of static flashed across the display. The fan inside whirred violently, like the machine was overheating. Then, the entire system crashed. The screen went black. A second later, so did my phone. The screen blinked once. Then, without warning, it started dialing a number. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't pressed a single button. The call went through. A blocked number. I sat frozen, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I didn't answer, but I could hear it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Someone on the other end, listening. I tightened my grip on the phone, forcing myself to stay calm. Then a voice. Not a whisper this time, not a warning, just 2 words. Stop digging. The call cut out. I let out a shaky breath, staring at my phone like it was something infected. That wasn't just a threat, it wasn't just a warning. It was a command. I looked back at my laptop, still black-screened, still dead. The file was probably corrupted now, maybe wiped completely. But it didn't matter. I had seen enough. And now, they knew that I had seen it. A waitress walked over, placing the check on the table. Need anything else? I shook my head. She hesitated. Then, quieter, she said, You okay? I forced a small nod. Yeah. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push, just walked back toward the counter. I stared at my reflection in the darkened screen of my laptop. I had a choice. I could stop now, walk away, pretend none of this ever happened. Or I could finish what James started. I thought about the SUV that had followed me, the man in the gray suit who had slipped me the note, the housekeeper, the sound engineer, the people who had vanished. And James. I thought about James. He had left that message for a reason. Because he knew someone would come looking for him. Because deep down he had known he wouldn't make it out. And now they wanted to make sure I didn't either. I stood up, tossing cash onto the table, and walked out of the diner. I wasn't stopping. Not now. Because I was done being scared. And whoever was behind this, they should be too. Chapter 8. The Vanishing Act. I didn't go home right away. I didn't know if I even had a home to go back to anymore. Instead, I drove. Not anywhere specific, just away, far enough to clear my head, far enough to try and convince myself that what had just happened at the diner wasn't as bad as it felt. But it was. I had gone too far, and they knew it. The black SUVs, the note in the diner, the phone call, they weren't just warnings, they were steps in a process. A process that ended with someone like me vanishing without a trace. Just like James. It was just past 2 a.m. when I finally pulled up outside my apartment building. The street was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I sat there for a long moment, staring up at my window, waiting to see if I'd spot movement inside. Nothing. I checked my mirrors. No strange cars parked nearby, no silhouettes lurking in the shadows. But that didn't mean I wasn't being watched. I stepped out of the car, forcing myself to move slow, casual, act like nothing was wrong, even though every nerve in my body screamed otherwise. When I reached my door, I hesitated. Then I saw it. The door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it before I left. Twice. My chest tightened. I pushed the door open, stepping inside, heart pounding in my ears. The apartment was silent. It was silent. Everything looked the same at first glance. The books on my desk, the coffee mug from this morning, the blinds still half open like I had left them. But something was wrong. It took me a second to notice it. The hard drive I had been backing up my notes on, gone. The files on my laptop, erased. Even my notebook, the one I had scribbled everything in, was missing. I turned slowly, scanning the room. They hadn't just erased the files. They had been here, inside, standing where I was standing now. I could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I checked my phone. No service. Then I turned to the security cameras. I had set them up myself, a cheap system, nothing high-tech, but enough to catch anyone snooping around. I pulled up the footage. For a moment, everything seemed fine. The last saved clip was from earlier that day, me leaving the apartment. Then, just past midnight, the next clip appeared. Nothing but static. For 3 full hours. Then, just before I had pulled up outside, the cameras came back on. No footage of anyone coming in, no footage of anyone leaving. They had wiped it. Clean. I felt a slow, creeping dread crawl up my spine. They were erasing me. I had one last option. A name I hadn't wanted to use, a retired detective I had met years ago while covering a case. His name was Miller. He had worked on high-profile missing persons cases before quitting the force and retreating into quiet obscurity. But he had seen things. The kind of things that made men drink themselves to death. If anyone could tell me what the hell was happening, it was him. His place was outside the city, a run-down bungalow that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. The porch light flickered on. Then the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. His hair was gray, unkempt, stubble covering his face. He stared at me for a long second before sighing. "I was wondering when you'd show up." That stopped me cold. He stepped aside, motioning me in. I hesitated, then walked inside. The place smelled like old books and whiskey. Papers were scattered everywhere, old case files stacked on every available surface. Miller collapsed into a worn-out armchair, rubbing his face. "You're here about James." I nodded slowly. "How do you?" He waved me off. "I know a dead man walking when I see one." That made my stomach twist. I sat down across from him, the weight of everything pressing against me. What the hell is happening? Miller sighed, staring at the floor like he was debating how much to tell me. Then, finally, he said, "You don't get it, do you?" I clenched my fists. "Then explain it." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You're trying to solve a case that doesn't exist." The words hit like a gut punch. I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Miller looked up, his eyes haunted. James never existed. Not officially. No records. No paper trail. Just like the others. My throat went dry. What others? He stared at me for a long moment. Then he grabbed a dusty folder from the pile beside him and tossed it onto the table. I opened it. Inside were photos. Nay, people who had disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. Former employees, security guards, assistants, people who had worked inside the industry, people who had gotten too close, people who had been erased. My blood turned to ice. "This isn't new," Miller muttered. "You think you're the first person to ask questions? The first person to dig?" I couldn't speak. "Let me tell you how this ends," he continued. "You keep going, you disappear. Your files, gone. Your story, never told. And people will forget you existed." I forced myself to swallow. James tried to warn me. Miller nodded, and now I am. I clenched my jaw. "I'm not stopping." Miller let out a dry chuckle. "You remind me of him." I stood up. "Thanks for the warning." He didn't stop me as I walked to the door. But just as I reached for the handle, he spoke one last time. "If you're smart, you'll make a backup." I paused. Miller sighed. "It won't save you, but it'll make sure they don't win." I drove straight to an internet cafe on the other side of town, paid cash, logged onto a private server, and I uploaded everything. James' video, the blueprints, the security footage. Every last piece of evidence. A backup for someone else to find, just in case I didn't make it. I got back to my apartment just after 3 a.m. I hesitated before stepping inside, checked my mirrors, checked my locks. Nothing. I was about to exhale when I heard it. A single footstep in the hallway, then another, slow, deliberate. I turned my head, heart hammering. The sound stopped. The hallway was empty. But I knew better now. I stood frozen, hand on the doorknob. Then, a knock. Slow, rhythmic, mild. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, and then silence. I swallowed hard. Then I turned and opened the door.